What is a frontier people group? 4,000 years ago, God made a covenant proclaiming that through Abraham's offspring, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. 2,000 years later, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection fulfilled that promise. This news was so important that Jesus gave his followers a mission. Go to all nations and proclaim that through him, there was a path back to right relationship with God. Ever since that day, God's people have worked toward the fulfillment of that mission. So, now that we've been on mission for 2,000 years, how are we doing at taking the gospel to all peoples? Let's start with some amazing news. Faith in Jesus is spreading at an accelerating rate. At Pentecost, gospel movements were present in places that contained only 2% of the world's population. In 1792, William Carey identified that the gospel had spread through cross-cultural witnesses to places containing 25% of the world's population. In 1974, Ralph Winter estimated that 40% of the world lived in people groups with multiplying communities of believers. And today, global followers of Jesus have increased by 400%, and believers are present and multiplying in people groups containing 75% of the world's population. That means 6 billion people have active Christ followers in their people groups, and thus have at least some access to the gospel. You may have heard about Unreached people groups, or UPGs, people groups with fewer than 2% believers and fewer than 5% professing Christians. At the First Lausanne Congress in 1974, it was estimated that 60% of humanity lived in roughly 17,000 people groups without any multiplying communities of believers. Today, that number has decreased to an estimated 4,800 people groups containing just 25% of the world's population. God's kingdom has advanced more in the past 50 years than in any other period before it. But there's still more work to do. Yes, by God's grace, 40% of the global UPG population now has Christians among them. However, according to the best available research, there has been essentially no progress of the gospel in the remaining 60%. Missiologists call this 60% of UPGs frontier people groups, or FPGs. Right now, there are almost 4,800 FPGs, totaling 25% of the world's population. These 2 billion people still have little to no chance of even meeting a follower of Jesus in their own people group. Less than 0.1% of their population is Christian, and they desperately need pioneer workers to cross language and culture barriers to establish the first multiplying communities of believers among them. Who are these 4,800 frontier people groups? Religiously, 3% of the population of all FPGs are Buddhist, Sikh, and Animist. 41% are Hindu, and 56% are Muslim. Geographically, 98% of the global frontier people group population lives in fewer than 70 countries inside the 1040 window, an area of the world between 10 degrees and 40 degrees latitude, containing North Africa, the Middle East, and much of Asia. 70% of that population is concentrated in just South Asia. In fact, more than 50%, half the population of all the FPGs in the world, live in just one country, India. That's 800 million Hindus and 200 million Muslims in one country, waiting to hear about the love of Jesus and join his worldwide family. You may be thinking, if there's so much need and opportunity among them, surely the majority of missionaries are going to frontier people groups. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. 96% of all missionaries work among people groups where 99% of the world's Christians live. Only 3% go to unreached people groups. That leaves just 1% of all missionaries among those 4,800 FPGs. 4,500 workers for 2 billion people. Think about this. India's population of 1.4 billion is nearly equal to all of Africa at 1.5 billion, and more than double that of Latin America at 0.67 billion. Yet India, where half the remaining FPGs are located, receives only 1/10 the cross-cultural workers that are sent to Africa and Latin America. The imbalance is staggering. But how do we balance it? How do we prioritize and strategically engage all people groups, especially the least reached? What if we started with the largest frontier people groups, the ones with a population of more than 10 million? These few dozen groups cover nearly half the population of all FPGs. Then we could engage the frontier groups with a population of more than 1 million. Sending laborers among these few hundred mega people groups would cover about 80% of the FPG population, 1.6 billion people. And many of these larger frontier groups have significant influence over smaller neighboring FPGs and could even potentially engage them through near-culture strategies. Right now, there are more than 4 million churches globally. That's 800 churches for every frontier people group. If the global family of Christ keeps the finish line in view and works together strategically, could we see multiplying disciples and fellowships begin to spread throughout every remaining frontier people group in our lifetime? In the next few years? Could we be the generation through which the good news of the kingdom is finally preached to every remaining people group? It's a huge task, but it's possible. And you have a role. God calls all His people to participate in spreading the gospel to all people groups. He calls some to pray. He calls some to mobilize. He calls some to send, and He calls some to go and take the gospel where it has never been preached before. How is God calling you?